Welcome everybody to the Ishtar channel. I'm Jo Rushton. I'm with, of course, the lovely Inasa Mabu Ishtar, who's the founder of the Ishtar channel, who's had an incredible experience for many, many years working with a council of masters. And at some point, I would love us to come together and have a chat about that journey, Ishtar.
Oh, yes, we can do that at some stage.
But today we're number one, wanting to address some foundational concepts on our path of spirituality and opening to our deeper connection with ourself. We want today to talk about the subject of the mind. I think it's a confusing subject at the best of times, because that's the nature of the mind. It loves to create confusion. And what we are going to discuss today, and I'm going to begin the discussion with something I'd like you all just to take a breath and to consider, because our discussion is around the mind versus consciousness. And the first thing I want you to consider is that consciousness doesn't need the mind to exist. But for the mind to exist, it does need consciousness. Now, if you were to sit and meditate on that for, I would say, quite a while, then, as it has for me, it opens something else within. Every time I bring myself back to the understanding that consciousness doesn't need the mind, but yet our mind needs consciousness in order to have a mind. And just that one statement, that one idea, that one concept can help to open your mind to a greater understanding of who and what you are. So the first question I'm going to ask Ishtar is how, over all the years, 25, 30 years now of journeying deeply with your own consciousness, how do you differentiate between the mind that we might speak of located in the brain, although also lives within every cell, and consciousness? Because when we speak of consciousness and we speak of the mind, they are two different things. How would you differentiate?
I'm going to tell you a story. I'm being guided just to share with you a little story. Before I started channeling the masters, the ascended masters, I used to offer workshops, weekend workshops, and meditations, meditation groups. And when I was preparing a workshop, I'd think about a topic that I wanted to put forward, and I would do my research and I'd look it up and go to books or whatever I needed, and I would learn whatever I needed to present, and I'd put it all in a little manual, and that's what I'd hand out at the workshops. And we'd go through the manual, page by page. We'd go through the manual of all the information that I'd collated from wherever I'd collated it from teachings, books, all the knowledge that I had in my mind. All that I learned through my mind, all that knowledge. And they were great workshops. We had a lot of fun. We learned lots. And our minds felt very sated at the end. Now, when I started working with the masters, and I had been working with them for a couple of years and started doing workshops again, and they would guide me about what the topic would be. And I would go, oh, okay, I'll go and start researching that topic. And I'll go and find books, and I'll go and do what I used to do. And through my mind, I would research and get all the knowledge I needed to share, to share with others. And the master said, no, there will be no manual, there will be no books, there will be no knowledge and research done. This is going to come through consciousness, come through spirit. And of course, I was horrified. My mind was horrified. How can I possibly do a workshop without a little manual and without going and doing all this research? I was asked to channel the consciousness, the wisdom of the masters, and to set my mind aside so the channel could come through. For a whole workshop, for 2 days, for a 2-day workshop, or a retreat for 7 days, or sometimes we do a workshop for 4 days. And that was the most horrifying experience I've had on my spiritual path, I think, or one of them, because my mind so struggled with that, because it wanted the knowledge. It wanted to know what I was going to do before I did it. It didn't want to be in the now. It wanted to be in the future. It wanted to plan and be in the future, which is what the mind does. It wanted to have all this knowledge and be very well prepared for when the time came that I was going to present all of this. And the masters would say, no, you're going to be channeling this. This is going to be you sharing consciousness with them about whatever the topic was. And it would be a topic that I had no idea about. My mind had no knowledge of. I hadn't done any research on it. And often they would give me 4 words for a whole workshop. They would be 4 words. And that would be it.
Sounds like a presenter's nightmare.
It was very frightening. But I had to sit in consciousness. So my mind was terrified that I had to sit in consciousness. So when I was channeling, I had to learn to discipline the mind, to step aside, to have no thought. Because the mind constantly has thought. But consciousness has no thought. Consciousness just is. Consciousness holds no knowledge. It's not about knowledge. And I think this is very interesting that so many students I have watched over the years go to spirit, because consciousness is spirit, and want knowledge. They want to know what's going to happen tomorrow or next month or next year. They want to have knowledge of something. But consciousness holds no knowledge. It doesn't know what's going to happen next year, because you don't know what's going to happen next year, because it hasn't happened. Consciousness lives in the now, in this moment now, and is present in this moment now. It has no interest in looking ahead 12 months from now, because that hasn't happened yet. And so many variables come into place when things are in the creation flow. So consciousness is always present in the now, which is the most terrifying thing for our mind. Because our mind doesn't want to be in the now. Our mind wants to be often in the past, sort of ruminating around what's happened to see how we can make it different. Or it wants to be in the future, planning what it's going to do next. And that's the nature of our mind. But consciousness works through what I call wisdom, or the conscious mind, if you will. Let's call it the conscious mind. But it has no thought. It is simply present. And it speaks to what is occurring in this moment. So it'll speak to, if you're speaking to a group, it'll speak to the consciousness that is occurring in this moment in the group. And it'll bring through a vibration that resonates to the group in some way, sometimes activating, uplifting, sometimes challenging, but flowing, always flowing, where the mind is almost a staccato energy. It's there. What's my next thought? What am I going to do? What's going to happen? Where am I going to go? Who am I going to be? What am I going to do now? La la da 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 da. It's all of this, you know. What can I say? What can I share? And that's the mind, and it's constant, 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 constant. The consciousness is simply present. Present in this moment, present in the next, and flowing with the energy that exists in this moment. So if we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about our spirit, the universal spirit. There are many layers. We can talk about what we sometimes call the lower mind, which is the mind of what we're talking about. And then we can talk about the higher mind, or the super consciousness, which is what we're talking about in terms of the soul or the spirit or presence. And the presence of source, which you could call the universal mind or the Buddhic mind. There are many terms for this. But consciousness certainly doesn't plan ahead, doesn't plan. It doesn't try to see the future. It doesn't adhere to the belief that everything's set in stone and nothing's ever going to change. It's all been set a long time ago by God, and it's all been written in tablets, and everything's going to happen as it's written. Consciousness is just present in the moment, in this moment, and in the next moment. Now, consciousness and the mind can work together, because as Jo said, consciousness has no need of the mind. It exists outside of the mind. But the mind can certainly do with consciousness. It won't exist without consciousness, because you won't exist without your spirit, without your presence. If presence walks away from you, your soul walks away from you, there is just a husk, the body. There is no mind, because you're actually no longer alive. Presence keeps you alive. Spirit keeps you alive in the body. So when the mind begins to work with consciousness, with presence, with soul, with spirit, whatever you want to call it, then the mind begins to drop away a lot of its thought, its busyness, its attachments, its desires, because it then tends to merge a lot more with consciousness. It becomes conscious. So we call being awakened being conscious in our life, so that we act in a conscious way. Now, for most of us, we can be very conscious in the moment, certainly when we meditate, certainly when we focus on our consciousness. We call our consciousness to be present, or we allow our consciousness to be present. But the mind can shut down that part of ourselves and just be the mind, the egoic mind, the ego mind, and be filled with thoughts, attachments, desires, needs, fears, worries, anxiety, stress, all of those things that come up for the mind. But when we sit in consciousness, they don't exist, because the consciousness hasn't had them. So the more we begin to align to consciousness and be aware and allow consciousness to be present in our lives, even if it's just for 5 minutes a day, the more the mind calms, the more the mind stills, and the less thoughts keep running around on that little wheel that runs in our mind. and the less importance we place on the knowledge that our mind holds, you know, the beliefs that our mind holds. And our beliefs often create such separation that our consciousness never does. Because our consciousness is, but it doesn't have a belief that it is, it just is. Where our mind has a belief of what and who it is, because it couldn't exist unless it had a belief about what and who it is. It would be lost. The mind would be very worried if it didn't have a belief about who it was. Whether that belief supports the person or not is a very different thing. But the mind will become very attached to that belief. But the consciousness has no belief. The consciousness simply is. It has no need to have a belief about what it is. It just is. In full connection, in full expansion of what it is. And of course, our mind is often very fearful of that, fearful of becoming lost in the consciousness. So when we do our 5 minutes a day of connection, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever that might be, the mind often shuts it down and wants to get on with its busy day because it has a fear of consciousness. It has a fear of becoming lost in the consciousness. And that's because you, your personality, that belief that you hold of who you are, has this incredible fear of being lost in your consciousness. But understanding that the more you connect with your consciousness, not needing to shut down the mind, but having a mind and a consciousness working together, the more you bring the two together by allowing consciousness to be more present in your life, then the more you will find that grace flows in your life, because consciousness always flows with grace. And that's the story of consciousness.
So my experience of you speaking, my mind quietened to such a point where my being came into a place of stillness, literally to the point where I'm finding it difficult now to start a conversation again, because I've just experienced sitting in my consciousness, receiving a transmission. And I was very conscious to the moment that transmission started. And I felt an entire shift in my whole being, but significantly through my mental body. All the questions left, I came into a place of, I would call sacred listening and sacred receiving simultaneously, where there was no more, what am I going to ask Ishtar next, going on. There was a stillness and a clarity and an expansiveness. I experience this a lot when I'm receiving your channels. So what I'm sharing here, and I'm hoping our listeners were able, you know, I'm going to ask our listeners just to go back now and just reflect on their energy whilst they were listening to Ishtar explain, because there was a frequency being admitted into our field. And that frequency brought me into a complete place of, when I say no mind, I just mean an emptiness within my mind where I could be at a place of peace, listening without thought.
And that's a stillness that comes through that frequency of presence or of consciousness that holds a vibration. And it's not simply about just slowing your voice down.
No, not at all.
It's not about how you're really speaking. It's simply allowing the presence of consciousness to be present in the field, in your energetic field. And it has nothing to do with voice or cadence. It's about that frequency of vibration of presence, being allowed to be present. And that's the key, is being allowed to be present. And that's your mind allowing that. You know, I can remember when I first started channeling the masters, and my mind wasn't very well trained and it wasn't very still. And yet the masters would be coming through to a group every week. And my mind, as they're talking, my mind would be having a conversation with itself, saying, oh, I don't know whether I agree with that. I don't know about that. What am I supposed to do with this? I don't think they're saying the right thing. And my mind would be going on and on and on. And it was very uncomfortable. But the masters, the consciousness of the masters, they weren't perturbed at all by my mind having this little debate and discussion with itself. But I have to say I was, because I was so conscious of the different vibrations of what was moving through me. My mind was this busy vibration of energy that, to be really honest, would not shut up, to be honest. And then the masters would be just talking through, and this flow of frequency would be moving through me. And yet my mind just wasn't even registering it. So it's what our minds can do, can completely shut off from that vibration and not receive it. And it took 6 months for that to stop for me, for my mind to come into stillness. 6 months of training with the masters for my mind to come into stillness, so that I could just then feel the presence of frequency moving through. I no longer have to listen to thoughts and debate.
This is and the key that I'm hearing, which has helped me over the years really differentiate between being in the mind versus opening to my consciousness, is the differentiation between the vibration and the frequency. And they have two very different vibrations: the vibration of consciousness and the vibration of mind. The mind is still energy.
Yes.
Consciousness is still energy. But the two are operating at very different dimensional frequencies.
That's right.
And so learning, before we can even begin to merge the two, marry the two, allow the mind and our consciousness to be co-creators together, we have to start to become aware of the difference in the frequency in order for us to have a sense of when am I in my mind, and have a sense of when am I opening to my consciousness.
It's exactly right. Yes. Mm.
So from that perspective, what are some of the, I would say, differentiations, red flags? The mind sits very much in polarity, so its energy is going to be very affected by duality and polarity, and
Yes.
therefore energy can be so much more chaotic. What are some of the things that we can give our listeners to start paying attention to help them become more self-aware for when they're in their mind versus having an experience of their consciousness?
I think one of the things to remember is breath. And I'm not saying breath work, I'm not saying somatic work, although I think those two words have been a little bit disabused more recently. But I feel that it's actually breath. When the mind is so busy and it's caught up in all its stories or whatever is going on for it and for you, we really need to stop and breathe. You know, you're on Facebook or Instagram or you're on TikTok, and there's something that comes up and you go into reaction. Oh, yes, I should be doing this, should be happening, they shouldn't be doing this, whatever it might be. Your mind is suddenly activated. There's no frequency. Your mind's caught up in some story that you're seeing on social media, or you're running in your mind because it's knowledge or a belief or an experience that your mind holds, or even a trauma that it takes you back to. And if you let that run away with you, you're going to become very anxious, very stressed. All your energy is going to come up. You're going to be all up here, and you're going to be clenching your teeth, and you're going to be projecting perhaps, or having that energy run through you in some way that's really not going to support you, perhaps causing some sort of illness or disease, because there is no consciousness there. So if we remember that we are a conscious being, and just take a breath and just allow consciousness to come back into presence again within us, to be present with us, just to let that happen. Now, that takes a little bit of practice and discipline. And I can tell you, I've had lots of practice with it and I forget. So, when you do forget, don't let yourself judge yourself for that. Let that go, and then just take a breath and come back in. And it might take 10 breaths, it might take 20 breaths, it might take half an hour of breaths, but choose to become more conscious. Just choose to slow the mind down. The other thing is, I think, and you've all heard this and you're all going to yawn, but seriously, looking at your phone, social media is probably one hand a really great thing, on the other hand the most detrimental thing we've given to humanity, because it keeps our mind busy, keeps our mind entrenched in stories, keeps our mind caught up in attachments and duality, and it brings up so much fear. So whenever we're caught up in that, we're not being conscious at all. We can't be conscious. And often when you spend days doing social media, whatever it might be, you're so far removed from consciousness that it's really impossible almost for you to come back and allow consciousness to be present. You really have to have some good discipline to do that. So that's another thing I would say to you, to be aware of that, to be aware of that. And I mean, it's so obvious because you can see children today, young children, who aren't on social media all the time, and their consciousness is very present. they're very connected to consciousness, to nature, to whatever. And then you see others who are constantly on social media or electronic devices and not conscious at all because their mind is so present. So it's a matter of just deciding, what do you want present? Your mind with all its thoughts, its divisiveness, its projections, its attachments, its needs, its wants, all its programs, because you have lots of programs, all its trauma, all its records, I mean, all of that stuff, or consciousness that brings you peace. I mean, it's a choice. And yeah, maybe you want a little bit of both. That's great. Make a choice for that. Make room for consciousness in your life so that you can live a conscious life. Because so many people say, oh, I'm being conscious. But what they're really being is mind. They're in their mind. I'm not going to say mindful, because a lot of people think mindful is being conscious. But being in your mind is not being conscious. Being in your mind is being trapped in all the energy that's sitting in that part of you, all memories, all stories, all attachments, all beliefs, all programs. And then, of course, all the knowledge that you have. It could be all the libraries of a great university and great stuff for academics, perhaps, but full of stories, full of attachment, full of polarity, full of duality, full of beliefs. Some that will serve us and some that won't. Consciousness, when you allow it to be present, expands you, uplifts you, and also guides you through that frequency. Not through a voice that says you must do this and you must do that and you need to do this and make sure you go and do that. That's your mind. That's not consciousness. But through its frequency, through the energy that it expands you with, so that the innate wisdom within your being becomes present. And through that wisdom, you live your life.
You see, I'm sitting in stillness again with very little that, when I'm in this place, very little that wants to, it's a receptivity that begins to open.
Yes.
And wants to just continue to receive rather than do, give.
That's right.
So there's a few things that we've covered in this first chat about the mind. Firstly, that mind and consciousness are not the same.
No.
That consciousness lives outside of the mind, and yet the mind relies on consciousness for us to be here, breathing, living. That consciousness, whilst the mind and consciousness both are energies and various frequencies depending on what consciousness we're opening to, the mind also is a frequency depending on what we're opening to, but it's a frequency of the third dimension.
Yes.
And so the mind's vibration is far more limited and contained to the experiences of the third dimension. Our consciousness, when we open to the vibrational scale, if you like, of consciousness, it can open us up through many, many different dimensions that aren't limited to the third, aren't limited to the physicality and the matter of our being. The next thing that we have covered or come into an understanding is that the key of breath, to come back to our breath consciously, is going to be the quickest and easiest of all tools to support the mind to open again to the consciousness that's there for it, if, and then this brings me to the last key point, if we choose.
Right.
Because it's a choice. So there's 4 really important keys that we've discussed today. The idea of mind, the frequency of mind and consciousness, the importance of breath, and that it is a choice to recognize, it is a choice to open to a different frequency within our being. It's not going to be the last conversation that we have on the mind, because I have many other things on this topic that I'd like to explore with you. But I feel at this point that what we've shared is a beautiful digestive appetizer.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
And
I think we really need to remember too, the mind is a beautiful construct, and it's not about getting rid of the mind. Please don't think that. It's just about understanding it and giving the mind an opportunity to make space for consciousness. So that, and that's why the breath is important, because the breath helps the mind to create space in the massive thoughts that it holds, so, and when we understand that, it's so much easier to bring that balance between mind and consciousness.
So I invite you all just to come and sit with your breath for a few moments now as we close. Thank you so much for such an enriching conversation. Thank you, Ishtar.
Always a pleasure, Jo. Wonderful. Blessings to you, blessings to everyone. May your mind and your consciousness become one. Thank you.